Hello, so in this video we're going to talk about Psalm chapter 2, and this is known as a royal psalm. So it speaks about God's role as king, as well as Israel's king, and then ultimately points to a future king or Messiah who is Jesus. And we see the dominion of this Messiah and the futility of opposing God, and then finally a promise of provision. So why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers conspire together against the Lord and his anointed one. Let's tear off their chains and throw their ropes off of us. The one enthroned in heaven laughs, the Lord ridicules them. Then he speaks to them in his anger and terrifies them in his wrath. I have installed my king on Zion, my holy mountain. I will declare the Lord's decree. He said to me, "You are my son, today I have become your father. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your inheritance, and the ends of the earth your possession. You will break them with an iron scepter, you will shatter them like pottery. So now kings, be wise, receive instruction, you judges of the earth. Serve the Lord with reverential awe, and rejoice with trembling. Pay homage to the Son, or he will be angry, and you will perish in your rebellion. For his anger may ignite at any moment. All who take refuge in him are happy." So as you can see here, the structure is the narrator is speaking about the nations opposing God in verses 1 to 3. And then in verses 4 to 6 is God's response to this. And then verses 7 to 9 is the anointed one speaking, quoting what God is saying to him. And then the rest is narration by the psalmist. And then I've also color-coded who is speaking and who's the subject. So at the start, we've got blue as the kings and the rulers, yellow as God, who is Yahweh, and then dark brown as the anointed one or the king. So in verse 1, it speaks about this vanity and foolishness about opposing God. And this describes our human condition, where by nature we often defy God and try and go our own way. And we often say, try to be true to yourselves. But what is inside ourselves is self-serving and prideful. And then we also see this figure who is called the Anointed One. And in the immediate context, it refers to the Davidic kings, so David, Solomon, and those after him. And when they're coronated, they are anointed, and they're called God's anointed as king because the king represents God, particularly with Israel being his chosen nation. There is also a more cosmic, greater scale to this, which speaks to an ultimate anointed one, which we will see next in 1 Chronicles 17. Now, there is a parallel passage to this in 2 Samuel, but in 1 Chronicles, I will be his father and he will be my son. I will not remove my faithful love from him as I removed it from the one who was before you. I will appoint him over my house and my kingdom forever, and his throne will be established forever. So God promises David a descendant who will have an eternal kingdom, who will be called God's son. And the title Son of God can mean different things, and we can't really tell the difference based on the grammar and the language. So we must look to contextual clues. So throughout the Old Testament, there are figures who share particular descriptions, promises, and events which are unique and can only fit to one person. And yet they each have different names. So these figures are all encompassed as one person who came to be known as the Messiah, or the Anointed, and it is who the Jews looked forward to. And it is because they derive it from this promise to David in Chronicles and 2 Samuel. So an example of this is in Daniel 7, it speaks of a figure called the Son of Man, who comes on the clouds of heaven, which is a divine description, and yet is distinct from God, who in the passage is called the Ancient of Days. And the Son of Man is said to receive an eternal kingdom and dominion, which is a clear parallel to this promise to David's descendant. So this connects the figure of the Son of God to the Son of Man. Another similar example in the Old Testament is Psalm 110. So it speaks of a Lord who is greater than David, and yet Yahweh is talking to this Lord, and he's described as an eternal priest. There are also many other examples, but this would be a whole separate topic on its own. So then, in verse 2, it uses God's covenant and personal name Yahweh. But here in verse 4, it uses the word Adonai, which is a more general word for authority or kingship. And in verse 6, it is God speaking. So the idea of people opposing God is amusing to him. For who can stop the all-powerful and the immortal? It is he who brings disaster and calamity and his holy wrath. And so we should all beware God's awesome power and fear his sovereignty with due respect. And then in verse 6, we see this idea of Zion. So originally it was a fortress which David conquered. And then throughout the Psalms and the rest of the Old Testament, it represents this idea of God's dwelling place, his sanctuary and throne on earth. And then it points to a greater future reality in heaven. And then we have this transition from God speaking in verse 6 to now the Messiah speaking in verse 7. And it is clearly distinguished from Yahweh. So in verse 7 is often quoted in the New Testament, having fulfillment in Jesus, identifying him as King, Messiah, and God's unique Son. This proclamation of being God's Son in the context of being given dominion is evocative of the promise to David in Chronicles and 2 Samuel. Now, as mentioned previously, there is a double fulfillment. So God is declaring Israel's king, who is anointed, as protected by God. But verse 8 speaks of a worldwide dominion, suggesting a future more exact fulfillment. And this is consistent due to the connection with the Davidic promise, for it had some immediate fulfillment in Solomon, but also had a future descendant in mind. And then in verses 9 to 12, so we see the Messiah's judgment over the nations for their rebellion. And this idea of the iron scepter symbolizes the Messiah's reign and authority, and is often quoted in Revelation. And it is a warning to those that defy God and his Messiah. They are told to be wise or else. And we too have this option before us now. Either worship and serve God with awe and fear, or receive judgment when Jesus, the Messiah, returns. And then on the other hand, in verse 12, it is a promise of comfort to those that follow God, that though the rulers of this world may pursue evil, God's purpose will come to pass with justice in the end. And this was accomplished on the cross, where Jesus, the unique Messiah and the only Son of God, took away the sins of the world, and those that believe in this salvation and his resurrection will live with him forever. So let us pursue God and not conform to the patterns of this world. Even our leaders may go against God, but we serve one ruler above all, Jesus, our God and Master. Amen.